Okay, welcome everyone to today's class. And today we are discussing a topic of demand and supply. And previously we have discussed few topics that lead to this topic. So we'll try to connect them here. So let me go back to that background. So in the chapter one, we already discussed that what is economics and the role of scarcity in our decision making. So we did one activity related to this topic. So there was a concept of scarcity and decision making in it. Chapter two talked about the how firms will decide to produce based upon scarce resources. So we discussed in that chapter the topic of PPF. So production possibility frontier was studied. That was a method to decide how firms will maximize their production with the given resources. Chapter 3, we discussed the consumer equilibrium, to CE, consumer equilibrium, where we decide how consumer decides to buy based upon the limited income and the product. So consumer equilibrium was talking about how consumer decides, and PPF was talking about how producer decides. Both chapter 2 and 3 were talking about the allocation of resource, means the buyer, how buyer is dividing his income for product A and product B. And for chapter 2 we were talking about how seller is allocating his income for for allocating his resources between two outputs that he can produce. So now we will study the use of resource, means the purchase and sale decision which depends upon other agents. So now actually in this chapter we'll talk about how seller and buyer interact. Means in the previous two topics we were not talking about how they are interacting with each other. Now we are talking that what will happen if they are interacting with each other. So what are the implications? Okay, so this is the background of the topic that we're going to start. So before starting, first of all, start with the markets. So a market is a place or a platform where seller and buyer meet to trade goods and services. So it's a place. So it's not a physical place, just like we use market in Urdu or in English. It's a market also means it's a platform. It can be a non-physical market. For example, shopping stores, it's a physical market. E-commerce, it's a website. And teleshop, it's a telemarket via SMS or call. Postal orders, it's via post. Or in newspapers, newspapers, that is using advertisement. We also call it yellow pages. Okay, and then mobile apps, just like the Raz.pk or eBay or Amazon. So these are the platforms where seller and buyer can meet to exchange goods and services. So buyer is going there to buy the things and seller is going there to sell the things. So buyer have the income to spend and seller have the goods to sell. So they exchange the items. So buyer gets the goods and seller gets the revenue. So market is a place or a platform where sellers and buyers meet to trade goods and services. Okay, so then we go towards the term demand and supply. Okay, the term demand means, so first of all we'll give a general definition, then we'll build on it. So generally, demand is a relationship between price and quantity demanded in a given period of time, ceteris paribus. Here, uh, ceteris paribus means that remaining other things constant. Uh, so let me clarify it here. So demand means that uh, so for a buyer, he is there to buy things. So he has decided some quantity demand, said he is going to buy this much. But his decision depends upon how much is the price of the product. So the relationship of in terms of buyer between price and quantity demand is demand. So in other words, it means that how much buyer will buy based upon the given prices is demand. So it shows that how much buyer purchase, how purchasers or buyers will respond to the change in the price of the product. So demand here means that it gives us a formula or a graph that tells us that the buyer, let me clear it up. So save and clear. So it means there's a calculator. There's a calculator in the head of buyer, and that calculator gives one output, that is how much to buy, and there is one input, that is the price. So input is price and output is buy, how much to buy. So the relationship between this input and output is demand. So the way the buyer decision changes based upon the existing price for the buyer is demand. Similarly, for a seller, the relationship that exists between price of the good and quantity supplied in a given period of time, ceteris paribus. So it means assuming other things constant, what is the relationship between the price and how much the seller is supplying is called supply. So it tells us how much sellers will respond to the change in the price of the product. So opposite to that, so there is an input, that is price, and output is sell. So there is a calculator in the mind of the seller, and there is one input and one output. So the relationship between input and output is supply. So I already talked about the ceteris paribus. So in simple words, the demand and supply is how the purchase decision. For a demand, it talks about purchase decision, and for supply, it talks about selling decision. So how selling decision or the purchase decision depend upon the price of the product. So in both cases, the price is same. So when we talk about demand, we are talking about the relationship between price and purchase decision. And when we talk about the supply, we are talking about price and selling decision. So both are actually representing their relative agents. So demand is representing the customer or household HH. Supply is talking about seller or firm. So they both are different agents, but for both price is common. But demand will talk about the purchase decision and the price, and the supply will talk about selling decision and the price. So this is the demand and supply. Let's go towards next slide for more details. So what do we meant by response? So I used the word response in the previous slide. Means demand is the response of the buyer to the change in price. Supply is the response of the seller to change in price. So let's go in detail. So here response means that there is a psychological formula embedded in the mind of the buyer. Okay, so he has some psychological formula that gives him the answer regarding how much he should buy. This formula requires inputs like price and other factors like price, income, taste, weather, or other things. Like now we'll go towards that in detail. Okay, so there's a formula in the head of the buyer, and I call it psychological because we cannot see that formula. There's no there's no physical evidence that that formula exists. Okay, so that formula depends upon price and other product other factors. I have given three more. So these are the inputs. So suppose there is a psychological formula and the inputs are entered into it, and that formula gives us answer. So it responds in terms of how much to buy. So it's like a calculator where you enter some numbers and it gives us the answer. But in the calculator, actually we know what function we are applying. We are either doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. But in the psychological formula, we don't know what is being happening, but we only know that we have given the, so what is happening? The buyer goes to the shop and he wants to buy mangoes. Okay, so his calculator is there in the mind. So he asks the price of the product from the seller. So he gets one input. Then he evaluates how much income he has, second input. Third, how much taste is developed for mangoes, how much he wants. Third, what is the weather? Is it summer? Yes. So these three inputs are collected from the shop, from the market, and then customer adds these three inputs into his calculator or the psychological formula, and that formula tells him that you must buy this much x units. Okay, so the formula is actually giving us one number. Okay, specifically in detail when we go that we all know one thing regarding the formula. This thing is known. That is that increase in the price of the price is followed by lower answer. So this demand is telling us that we don't know the actual formula, but only one thing that we actually know is that when there is an increase in price, there is a lower answer, means how much to buy. So lower purchase. So price increase, purchase decrease. So this formula has this pattern. There's an inverse association between price of the product and the purchase decision. And this formula is called demand. Then for the case of seller, so for a seller there is a managerial formula. Why I call it managerial formula? Because it can be observed. So we can see that formula because they have a calculator or an Excel sheet where they do this calculation. So it's a managerial formula embedded in the seller. So a seller have this formula which requires inputs like price and other factors. So inputs are price, cost of the product, and there are many more like technology, etc., etc. So there are many more factors. We will go towards that in detail later on. So he has a formula. He goes to the shop and see how much is the price of the product, how much is the price of the product, and what is the cost to produce that item, and what is the technology available to produce that item. And he used this input to put it in his calculator, and and it responds in terms of how much to sell. That calculator or the formula gives him the output in terms of x units to produce. And since this formula is known, so we can clearly say that when prices increase, seller sells more. So we'll go towards that reason of why they sell more. But supply is generally is a managerial formula that takes some input and gives one output. And in that thing, there's one thing that is confirmed that when there is an increase in price, there is increase in decision to how much to sell. So this is the difference between demand and supply. In demand, the inputs are giving how much to buy, but when there's increase in price, there's a decrease in purchase. In supply, inputs are giving how much to sell, but here increase in price leads to increase in how much to sell. So these are the major differences between supply and demand. Hopefully it is clear for you. So let's move towards next point. So now we'll check how they are made in a graph. What is the graphical representation of this demand and supply? Okay, so following is a table representing buyers and sellers' response to each price. So in their calculator, we have given the value of the price. Other things they already know by themselves, and their calculator has given us the how much to buy and how much to sell. So how much to buy is actually called quantity demanded, and how much to sell is quantity supplied. So in the books you will see this word, not how much to buy or how much to sell. The response of the buyer to buy a single price is a quantity demanded. So if I say at this price, how much the buyer is buying? 80 units. So this is quantity demand. And how much the seller is selling? 39 units. This is quantity supply. So if the prices are given and then you have the answer, that then answer is called quantity demand. Okay. So the response of the seller to produce or to a single price is quantity supplied. So this is quantity demand and quantity supply. Now we are going towards differentiating with what is supply and what is demand. Okay, so demand is actually overall response to the of the buyer to any price. So suppose this is the changes in price and this is the response of the buyer. So when you compare these two, so response of the buyer, let me take different color. So response with respect to price is demand. So if you fix one price, the answer is quantity demand. If you take a series or different prices and you take a data, this is demand. So hopefully we will give more examples. So if you fix a price and you get an answer, we call that answer as quantity demand or quantity supply. But if you don't fix a price, you compare all prices with all supply or demand, we call it this is supply. Okay, so demand and supply. So supply is overall response to the to any price. Okay, so this slide is actually talking about the differences between demand and quantity demand and supply and quantity supply. So the difference is that in demand, no particular prices are given. There is a data or there is a pattern. In quantity demand, one price is given. In supply, all the prices are given as a chart. In quantity supply, one price is given. So this is the difference between quantity demand and demand. So I will summarize it here. So demand is actually, let me write it here so that you can see the answer. Let me clear it up. Some space here. Okay, so I will write it here. So write it here. So demand is how a buyer is responding to any market price. So demand will tell us the general behavior. So it is a general behavior of the buyer. Okay. So but quantity demand tells us how much a buyer will buy for a given price. So this is quantity demand. So this is actually a specific behavior, not a general behavior. So demand tells us generally we buy less when the goods are expensive. Okay. So I will give an example, e.g. we tend to buy less when the products are expensive. Here we are not actually talking about what was the price. It is actually when the prices are increasing. So here we have not provided the prices. We are actually talking about increase in prices. Okay. Here example is e.g. when the price of milk is Rs 80 rupees, I would like to buy 2 liters of milk. So what I am telling here is, so I am telling that if the prices are given, how much I will buy, that is 2 liters of milk. So the demand is the behavior to any price, and the quantity demand is the behavior to a given price. Okay. Now we talk about supply. So supply is how a seller is responding to the market price. So it is a general behavior of the seller. We are not fixing anything here, so it's a general behavior. Okay. For example, sellers sellers tend to sell more when the products are expensive because they tend to earn more from that. Here we have not talked about any specific price. Okay. Further, quantity supply tells us how much a buyer how much a seller will prefer to sell for a given price. It tells the specific behavior of the seller. So when the prices are given, seller will tend to sell more, and when prices are increasing, seller tries to sell more. This is supply. And when for a given price, that is quantity supply. So this way, I think it is clear for you that uh, that what is the difference between supply and quantity supply, and what is demand and quantity demand. Okay, so let's move forward. So here we are now talking about the graph. So we have the sheet in the previous data. So we put the prices on y-axis and quantity demand and quantity supply on x-axis. So we can plot them in a graph. So we can call it. So here we call it demand and price schedule or table. And if we make a graph, we can call it demand and supply curve. So following is a graphical representation of demand and supply based upon the table in the previous slide. Okay, so here this will help us to observe the pattern. Okay, here we can see that from the graph, the red line is the demand and the green line is the supply. Okay, so we saw in the graph that whenever there is an increase in price, there is a decrease in demand. So we have already discussed the uh, negative slope graphs previously. So what does negative slope graph tells us? So it is showing us that whenever the prices are increasing, so if they increase from 4 to 5, what is happening? There is a decrease in demand. So this is the negatively sloped. So if you pick any point in the graph, that point will be called quantity demand because it has a fixed price or a given price. But if you see the line, generally this is demand. So here you can differentiate that the particular decision, let's call this point a decision. How it is a decision? Because when the prices are 4, he is buying 40 units. So if you fix a decision, we call it quantity demand. If you look at generally towards the line, it is demand. Similarly, but you get different color. So for supply, if the price were 2, he was selling this much. When the price was 3, he tends to sell more with the increase in price. So it means if you say fix a point, then it is quantity supply. But if you look at the line, it is supply. So how this line is made? This is actually a plot of the table which we saw in the previous slide. So we put the prices on y-axis and quantity demand and quantity supply on x-axis. Okay. So let me take red color. So quantity demand and quantity supply. Okay. So the red line is the chart of quantity demand and the green line is the chart of quantity supply. So I have now differentiated between quantity demand and demand, quantity supply and supply. So supply is a general behavior, straight line. It is increasing when there is increase in price. So and if you fix a price 3, there is a quantity supply. That number will be 50. So this is quantity supply. And if you fix a price for demand, it will give you answer that is 40. So that is quantity demand. So the difference between demand and supply is the supply is a line and quantity supply is a dot. Or in simple words, supply is a general behavior and the quantity supply is a specific behavior to a given price. So for to convert the supply into quantity supply, you need to provide some input to the formula. Okay, so this is the difference between quantity demand and quantity supply, and these are demand and supply curves. So we'll go towards in detail why it is negatively sloped and why it is positively sloped. Hope it is clear now. Okay, so the reason behind the slope of the graphs are because of the law of demand and law of supply. So what defines the nature of demand and supply curve? Means it is talking about what determines the slope of these two graphs is because of the law of demand and law of supply. So we'll cover this point right now. So ceteris paribus means assuming other things constant, means assuming that there is no other change is happening here. When the price rises and there is an increase in the price of the product, assuming other things constant, and when there is a price is increase in the price, quantity demand of a good or a service falls and vice versa. So this law tells us when there is an increase in price, quantity demand falls. People tend to buy less, such that there is an inverse relationship between quantity demand and price. So means there is a inverse relation. Okay, this is the reason why demand curve is negatively sloped. So law of demand tells us that whenever the goods are expensive, the buyers are usually buying less, and this justifies the negative slope of the demand curve. Similarly, assuming other things constant, when there is an increase in price, so it's written in inverse form, in indirect form. So assuming other things constant, the quantity supply of good rises when there is an increase in the price. So it is telling us when there is a price increase, there is quantity supply increase. So such that there is a positive relationship between quantity demand and price. So this justifies the positive slope of supply curve, and we'll focus that reasons later on in detail. Okay, so the reasons for negative slope is substitution effect and income effect for demand, and reason for the positive slope is that higher price, higher profit, or higher price means higher production, which reduces the per unit cost of production. So these are few reasons which could be studied in detail in the course packs in the books. So law of demand and law of supply are the reasons behind the slope of the graph. Let's move forward. So what is law of demand? So we'll go going towards that in detail. So why the demand curve is negatively sloped? So we are studying an example. So if the price of Pepsi falls, people will buy more Pepsi, vice versa. So if you see Pepsi reducing its price in the market, so it means Pepsi is becoming cheaper. You will notice that more people are buying Pepsi. So it means there is more quantity demand, and vice versa means when prices are increasing, less people will buy. So I will explain the substitution effect first. So substitution effect is when the price of the Pepsi falls, it becomes relatively cheaper as compared to its substitute, which is Coca-Cola. So it means when Pepsi reduces its price, it will become cheaper than Coca-Cola. Hence, rational people who may maximize their resources, or new customers who are rational people actually will start to buy this good as compared to the expensive substitute. So it means if the Pepsi is cheaper and there is a new customer in the market, he will compare the prices. Since the price of Pepsi is lower than the price of Coca-Cola, okay, so he will buy Pepsi. So this is substitution effect. So people will leave buying Coca-Cola and buy Pepsi because Pepsi is cheaper. Second is income effect. Okay, if the price of Pepsi falls, the current customers of Pepsi can buy more Pepsi because they have higher income, and vice versa. So it means whenever there is a decrease in price, there two things are happening. So whenever there is a decrease in price of Pepsi, two things are happening. First, this price of Pepsi becomes lower than price of Coca-Cola. Okay, so what will happen? People will buy Pepsi as compared to Coca-Cola. So the demand for Coca-Cola will fall, and demand for Pepsi will increase. Secondly, when there is a decrease in price, so the people will feel that their income can buy more Pepsi because Pepsi is cheaper. So they will use their income to buy Pepsi rather than to buy Coca-Cola, because for a particular income they will be able to buy more Pepsi as compared to Coca-Cola because Pepsi is cheap. So this is the reason why there's an inverse relation. So there's a decrease in price and there's an increase in quantity demand. So it's an inverse relation. and there are two ways it could be explained. Okay, so let's move forward and let's see if this point is explained in detail. Okay, now he is defining quantity demand and quantity supplied. So we already discussed in the graph. Now it is giving us a definition. So quantity demanded is an amount of good that the buyer is willing and able to buy at a particular price. Means if you give him a price, he will decide how much he is willing. Willing comes from indifference curve. Enable comes from budget line, and how much is willing to buy. See, okay. So quantity demand changes only when there is a change in price. So this thing you have to remember that quantity demand only changes when there is a change in price. Okay, and demand changes because of other than the price. Okay, so we'll see that in the graph later on. So quantity demand only changes when there is a change in price. If anything other than price changes, then it will change the demand. Okay, we'll go towards that in detail. So we have already studied that there is no limit to willingness shown by the indifference curve. So the willingness comes from indifference curve IC, and the ability to buy depends upon the scarce resources, which is shown by budget line. So it means the quantity demand or demand curve can be made from indifference curve and budget line. We'll study that later on. Similarly, quantity supplied is the amount of the goods the seller is willing and able to sell at a particular price. So it means it's an willingness and ability to sell. The willingness comes from profitability and ability to comes from PPF. Okay, so quantity supplied only changes because of the price, and supply changes because of other than price. We'll see that in the graph detail later on. So here the willingness comes from the price ratio, which shows the profitability of the product. So we'll draw that later on, and the ability comes from the production possibility frontier. We have already studied this point. So it means the decision to supply comes from the ability to produce. For that, we have already discussed a relevant topic, and there is a willingness. For that, we will cover the price ratio concept later on. So hopefully it is clear now how demand is made and how quantity supplied is, how quantity demand is made and how quantity supplied is made. So what's the definition for demand? So let us clear it up here, and then we'll clear the screen. So I will give you a definition of demand here. So demand was the relationship between price and quantity demanded, and supply was the relationship between price and quantity supplied. Here now we have defined the term the quantity demand and quantity supplied. I hope it is clear now. Okay, so let's see what's in the next slide. So here's differentiated between demand and quantity demand. So we have already discussed this. So the line is the demand. This is an overall behavior. So how it is an overall behavior? So line is negatively sloped. So it is telling us what? That whenever there is an increase in price, there is a decrease in quantity. So while observing the line, we can say this thing. Okay, but when we look at the dot, what it is telling? So point A is actually telling us the quantity demand for price equal to 4, and quantity demand is how much? 150. So a particular point will give us an answer, and we call that quantity demand, and the line will give us a behavior, and we call it an inverse behavior. Okay, so let me sleeve it up and clear the screen. So how does quantity, how the quantity demand is changed and how demand is changed. So I will give this slide is an example to tell how demand will change and how quantity demand will change. Okay, let me go ahead. So here we can see that in a line, so this is the demand curve. How I notice it's a demand curve? Because there's a price here and quantity here and it's negatively sloped. So this confirms that it's a demand curve. So if I change a point from A to B, so this is a change in, so we call it change in quantity demand. So quantity demand is the change in the point on the graph when the price changes. So price has decreased. So we move from point A to point B. So demand increases. So when this thing happens, we say that this is change in quantity demand. Okay. So demand is the change in the line when there other than price changes, such that demand changes for the same price. So here you can see that there is a new demand curve. So you can see that at the same price the customer is buying more. So it means price has not changed, but the demand has changed. So it means something else has changed. So if price changes, we call it change in demand. If price is not changing, anything something else has changed and which is causing a change in demand, we call it change in demand. So they hope it is clear now. So when y-axis is changing, it will cause a change in quantity demand. If y-axis is not changing and still the line is changing, it is because of something else, not the price. So we call it change in demand. Now you see that same thing is for the price supply. So this is a supply curve because it's written price and quantity and it's positive slope. So when the price changes, so the point change from A to B. So it is change in quantity supply. But when the prices are same and still supply is increasing, so this is change in supply. So what other things could change? We'll go towards that in detail later on. Okay, hope it is clear now. So it was this was our topic for today, and hope you understood this point.